I confess this because the silence is now louder than the mountain. For 45 winters, I fed him, and only now that I'm gone, do I understand the terror in his eyes. The mountain takes, and the mountain gives. I know this better than anyone. I'm telling you this now because my logbooks won't. The official record will say I was just a man who kept to himself. But there is a truth buried under the ice, a truth heavy enough to crack a glacier. And it has to be spoken. If you stay with me, I will tell you why the creature you call Yeti doesn't fear our strength. He fears our weakness. He fears what we do when we are the ones who are afraid. My name is Kalen. For 50 years, since 1978, I was the sole caretaker of the old British weather station at Zemu Gap. It's a place the world forgot, a cluster of timber and corrugated iron perched above the Kangchenjunga Massif, watching the roof of the world. Most people assume I stayed for the solitude. They're wrong. I stayed as penance. In my youth, I was a guide. I was good, but I wasn't good enough on the day the mountain shrugged. I was the one who survived the avalanche that took my climbing partner. And my brother. The guilt from that day has been a cold companion ever since, more constant than the wind. My credibility isn't in a diploma. It's etched into the lines on my face and logged in the 50 volumes I kept meticulously. I can tell you the precise pitch of the wind as it whips through the tattered prayer flags I'd string up each spring, a high, lonely whistle. I know the specific groan of the station's old timber when a meter of snow settles on the roof, a sound like a tired giant turning in his sleep. I know the crackle of the shortwave radio as I'd scan the frequencies, just trying to find a human voice in a universe of static. My routine was my anchor, my prayer. Check the barometers, clear the solar panels of snow, listen to the ice. But one November, a new sound entered my world. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the grunt of a Himalayan black bear, sounds I knew like my own breathing. This was different. It came from the ridge just beyond the station, a deep, guttural chuffing. It was the sound of immense lungs struggling for purchase in the thin, frozen air. It was a sound of exhaustion, of pain, and it was followed by another sound, the distinct drag of something heavy, something limp, being pulled slowly through the fresh powder snow. The sound stopped, and a silence fell that was deeper than any I had known before. The next morning, driven by a dread I couldn't name, I put on my gear and went to look, and I saw them. The prints. They were pressed deep into the snow, deeper than any man could make. They were too long for a bear's hind paw, the shape all wrong, with an unnerving, almost human-like elongation at the heel. I followed them for 100 meters before they vanished near a sheer wall of rock and ice, a place no animal I knew could possibly ascend. I stood there, the wind stealing the warmth from my lungs, my heart a cold stone in my chest. Some secrets are heavier than the mountain, and this one had just been laid at my feet. That night, I couldn't check the barometers. I couldn't log the temperature. The routine was broken. The silence of the station was deafening, filled with the memory of that sound, that struggling breath. Every creak of the wood was a footstep. Every howl of the wind was a cry. The loneliness of the mountain, a thing I had wrapped myself in like a blanket for decades, had suddenly found a voice. It was a voice of suffering, and I felt, with a certainty that defied all logic, that I had to answer it. It was a choice that would define the rest of my life. I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I opened the footlocker that held my brother's remaining gear. I took out a portion of our shared stock of dried yak meat and a hard brick of sampa, barley flour, the fuel of this place. I bundled it up, pulled on my parka, and stepped out into the crushing cold. The moon was a sliver, and the stars were like chips of ice. I walked to the edge of the clearing, to the large, flat rock that overlooks the Zemu Glacier, the same rock where my brother and I would sit and plan our climbs. The wind was a physical blow, trying to push me back. I placed the offering on the stone. It felt both insane and absolutely necessary. I wasn't trying to trap anything, or study it, or prove it existed. I didn't know what I was doing, not really. I only knew that something out there was in pain, something vast and ancient and utterly alone. And in that moment, its loneliness felt exactly like my own. I was feeding a ghost, or a memory, or maybe, just maybe, I was finally feeding a part of myself that had been starving for 30 years. I was making an offering, and I didn't even know what God I was praying to. Pausa. I didn't look back. I walked back to the station, closed the door, and shot the bolt. I didn't watch, I didn't listen. I made a pot of tea and forced myself to open my logbook. Under the date, I wrote the barometric pressure, the wind speed, and the overnight temperature. I wrote nothing of the tracks, nothing of the sound, nothing of the food on the rock. It was a lie of omission, the first of many. I had made my choice. This secret was mine, a silent pact between me and the mountain itself. I would not be the man who brought the world crashing down on its mysteries. The next morning, the food was gone. There were no new tracks, no sign of any disturbance except for the clean, empty surface of the rock. It was as if a ghost had taken it. But I knew. I knew this was the beginning. It was the first word in a conversation that would last 45 years. I had given something, and something had received it. And in that silent exchange, the shape of my penance, the very reason for my existence on that lonely peak, was forever changed. I just didn't know yet the price that conversation would demand of me. My story is not an easy one to hear, and it's even harder to tell. But the truth of what happened up there needs to be known. So if you believe that some truths are worth the chill they bring, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Stick with me to the end, because the most terrifying part isn't the creature, but the discovery of what it was so afraid of. That first exchange began the rhythm that would define the next 45 years of my life. The pact. An offering for an offering. After that first night, I made it my new ritual. Every evening, just as the sun's last light bled from the sky behind the twin peaks of Sinyolchu, I would walk to the flat rock. I would leave a portion of my rations, sometimes the dried meat, sometimes sampa mixed with ghee, sometimes a handful of precious walnuts I'd saved. And every morning, the rock would be swept clean, as if by the wind itself. There was never a sign, never a footprint left behind. It was a silent, consistent, and deeply unnerving communion. For the first few weeks, that was all it was. A one-way offering into the void. I was feeding the silence, and the silence was consuming my offerings, leaving me with nothing but a deeper sense of the immense, watching presence that now saturated the mountain air. I felt like a man leaving tribute for a god he couldn't name. And the waiting was a kind of prayer in itself, a test of faith I didn't know I had. Then, one morning in early December, the exchange became a conversation. I approached the rock with my usual sense of nervous anticipation, and for the first time, it was not empty. My offering was gone, but in its place sat a single, perfect object. It was a fossilized ammonite, a spiral shell frozen in stone, the size of my cupped hands. The stone it was embedded in was dark and smooth, clearly from a sedimentary layer. I knew the geology of this place like the back of my own hand. There was only one cliff face within 50 kilometers where such fossils could be found. A sheer, treacherous wall on the north face of a peak that had never been successfully climbed. To retrieve this was not an act of an animal. It was a gesture. It was a gift. It was the second word in our silent language. And it meant, I see you. I understand this is a trade. I took the heavy stone back to the station, my mind reeling. The weight of it in my hands felt like the weight of a new reality settling in. This creature was not just surviving. It was intelligent. It had memory, and it understood reciprocity. The ritual now had a motor. It wasn't just me giving, it was an exchange. And with this new dynamic came a new set of unwritten rules, laws I had to learn through his stark and immediate enforcement. The first lesson was about privacy. A week after he left the ammonite, my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see him. I hid myself in a small rocky outcrop about 200 meters from the offering rock, armed with a pair of old military binoculars. I lay there for hours as the temperature plummeted, my body shaking with cold and anticipation. The sun went down. The stars came out. The moon rose. Nothing. A deep, profound stillness settled on the glacier. After what felt like an eternity, I gave up and returned to the station, defeated. The next morning, I went to the rock. The food I had left was still there, frozen solid. It remained there for 3 more days. A silent, stark rebuke. The message was clear. You do not watch me. This is built on trust, not on proof. I never made that mistake again. My next lesson was about proximity and sound. I learned that he would not approach if I was anywhere but inside the station with the door bolted. One evening, A particularly violent gust of wind blew my station door open with a loud bang just minutes after I'd left the offering. I hurried to close it, my heart pounding, knowing I had broken the sacred silence of the exchange. The next morning, again, the food was untouched. His absence was his vocabulary. It was how he taught me the boundaries of our arrangement. No sudden noises. No light shone in the direction of the high caves from where I now believed he descended. The offering had to be made at dusk, and I had to be sealed inside my wooden box, a silent partner in a world away. He set the terms, and I, the humble supplicant, had no choice but to obey. To break the rules meant a return to that absolute, crushing silence, a silence that was now worse than any storm because it was the silence of being truly alone again. That was a price I was no longer willing to pay. Once I understood the rules, our pact deepened. The gifts he left became more than geological curiosities. They became a form of protection, a language of the landscape itself. One spring, as the thaw was beginning, I woke to find a small, carefully constructed pyramid of stones, a cairn, piled in the middle of the path I always took to check my weather instruments on the far ridge. It was deliberate. It was a barrier. Annoyed at the detour, I took a longer, higher route. That afternoon, the entire path I would have taken collapsed in a massive rockslide, a roar of grinding stone and ice that echoed through the valley for a full minute. I stood on the high ground, watching the dust cloud settle, my blood running cold. He hadn't just left a gift, he had saved my life. The cairn wasn't a present, it was a sentence, a warning written in the language of the mountain. He was its guardian, and by extension, he was becoming mine. The mountain gives, and the mountain takes, and he was the one who seemed to know the difference. Another winter, a brutal fever took hold of me. I was shivering in my bunk, too weak to even light the stove. The world a blurry haze of pain and cold. I had run out of my meager medical supplies, and I genuinely thought I was going to die. I'd missed 2 nights of offerings. On the 3rd day, I managed to crawl to the door, driven by a desperate final instinct. There, on my doorstep, was a bundle of dark, pungent alpine herbs. The scent was overpowering, a mix of pine and something deeply earthy. I had seen local porters chew a similar plant for altitude sickness, but it grew only in the highest, most inaccessible meadows. I dragged them inside, crushed them, and steeped them in snowmelt over my small alcohol stove. The tea was bitter, but within an hour, the fever broke. He had known I was sick. He had ventured closer than ever before, right to my door, breaking his own rule of distance to deliver the medicine that saved me. Our pact was no longer about curiosity, it was about survival. It was a bond. The episodes became the chapters of my secret life. A string of intricately woven bird feathers left on the rock before a storm of unprecedented violence, a signal to double-check my moorings. A large, flat piece of slate positioned to reflect the morning sun in a peculiar way, drawing my attention to a fissure that had opened in the glacier near my water source. He was showing me the mountain's secrets, teaching me to see the world as he saw it, a living, breathing entity of immense power and subtle signs. I started to notice patterns in his own behavior. His tracks, which I would occasionally find after a fresh snowfall, never crossed the eastern ridge. Never. It was a boundary line he would not, or could not, cross. And from the high caves, on nights when the air was perfectly still, I would sometimes hear a rhythmic tapping sound, like stone on stone. It wasn't random. The tapping always, without fail, preceded a sudden, dramatic shift in the weather. He wasn't just living on the mountain, he was in dialogue with it. It was during the 4th year of our pact that I found the object that planted a seed of cold dread in my gut. Lying next to my portion of tsampa on the rock one morning was a piece of tarnished, heavy brass. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, and it was clearly man-made. It was the corner of some kind of plate, thick and beveled. With 2 holes where rivets would have been, it had strange, blocky lettering stamped into it, but it was in an alphabet I didn't recognize. Cyrillic, I would later learn. This was not a fossil. This was not an herb. This did not belong to the mountain. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crawled up my spine. Where had he found this? It felt wrong. It felt like a piece of a story that I didn't want to know. A piece of the outside world. The world of men. Intruding on our sacred, silent space. I took it, but unlike the other gifts, I didn't display it. I hid it. I wrapped it in an old cloth and tucked it away at the very bottom of my footlocker, under my brother's gear. That piece of brass changed something. It was the first clue that his history on this mountain was more complex than I could imagine. He wasn't just a creature of nature. He was a witness to human history, to our intrusions and our failures. The mystery of him, which had become a comforting, almost domestic presence in my life, now had a darker edge. What was he trying to tell me? Was it a warning? A relic from some long-forgotten expedition? The questions haunted me. My logbook entries remained sterile. Temperature, wind speed, snow depth. But my private journal, a small, leather-bound book I kept hidden, began to fill with frantic questions and sketches of the brass piece. I felt the weight of the secret growing. It was no longer just about protecting a creature. It was about guarding a history that the mountain itself had tried to bury. Some secrets are heavier than the mountain, and I was now carrying this one for him. It felt like holding a piece of a tombstone, without knowing whose grave it belonged to. The ritual continued, year after year, winter after winter. It became the scaffolding of my existence. My life was no longer measured in lonely years of penance, but in offerings given and gifts received. The creature, the old man of the mountain, as I had come to call him in my mind, was my only parishioner, my confessor, my silent companion. The fear I had initially felt had long since been replaced by a fierce, protective reverence. I was no longer just the caretaker of a forgotten weather station. I was the keeper of a pact. I was the sole guardian of a secret that was both beautiful and terrifying. The loneliness was still there, a low hum beneath the surface of my days. But it was no longer an empty, desolate thing. It was a shared loneliness, a quiet understanding between two solitary beings who had found each other at the frozen top of the world. Our silent conversation continued, written in stone and herbs and the absence of sound, a language known only to us. He taught me a new way to be human. My grief for my brother had been a sharp, jagged thing, a wound that never closed. But through the ritual, through the shared silence, and the small acts of mutual care, the nature of my guilt began to change. It softened. I was no longer just the man who survived. I was a man who was keeping something else alive. My penance had found a purpose. The offerings on the rock were no longer just for him. They were for my brother, too. They were for the life that was lost. The mountain takes, and the mountain gives. It had taken my brother, and in his place, it had given me this immense, secret responsibility. This strange, silent friendship that defied every law of the world I had left behind. The solitude was no longer a punishment. It had become a sanctuary, a sacred space shared by me and the ghost that haunted its highest peaks. I learned to anticipate his needs, and he mine. I could tell by the faint change in the scent of the wind when a sickness was sweeping through the animal populations and would leave out extra fatty portions of meat. In return, his warnings became more and more precise. He once left a single, long strand of his coarse, white hair tied around a pine branch, pointing down the mountain. 2 days later, a team of geologists I hadn't seen coming appeared from that exact direction, their presence a harsh intrusion. He had warned me they were coming. He was my lookout, my eyes and ears. We were a team, bound by the isolation and the immense, crushing power of the landscape we both called home. The fear that someone would discover us was a constant, low-grade fever in my blood. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the world of men would not come here with offerings. They would come with cages and with guns. This pact was my life's work. It was a fragile symbiosis, a secret held in the thin, cold air between my station and his caves. My entire existence was balanced on this ritual of giving and receiving. I was protecting him. Yes, but in a much deeper way, he was protecting me. He had given me a reason to survive the guilt, to endure the isolation, to find meaning in a life that had been hollowed out by loss. He had pulled me back from the edge of my own personal abyss. The piece of brass I kept hidden was a constant reminder, however, that our sanctuary was not inviolable. The past had a long reach, and its metal fingers were already touching the edge of our world. I just didn't realize that the past was about to come crashing into the present, and that our silent pact would be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The world below was stirring, and its eyes were slowly turning towards our mountain. For decades, our silent conversation was enough. I gave him sustenance. and he gave me a reason to live, a purpose etched into the daily ritual of survival. I was his anchor to a world that had, perhaps, forgotten him, and he was my connection to the soul of the mountain. I often wondered what he looked like, this silent partner of mine. I imagined a great, ancient primate, stooped and weary, with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 winters. I imagined him as a guardian, a lonely king on a throne of ice. But in all my imaginings, in all my quiet, speculative nights, I never once thought of him as being afraid. That was my greatest failure of imagination. I saw his power, his intelligence, his mastery of the mountain. But I never saw the terror in his eyes, not until the very end. And I confess this now, because I need you to understand that the greatest monsters are not the ones that hide in the shadows. They are the ones who are afraid of the dark. The years bled into one another, each winter a series of small, private episodes written in the snow. Our silent conversation became the central pillar of my existence. I'd find a perfectly balanced stack of ice-smooth stones on my windowsill and know a pressure drop was imminent. I'd leave out extra dried apricots, a rare treat, and the next morning I'd find my path to the glacier cleared of a recent rockfall. The loneliness I had carried for so long didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a void, but a shared space, a quiet understanding between myself and the old man of the mountain. The mountain takes, and the mountain gives. It had taken my brother, but it had given me a reason to greet the dawn, to measure the wind, to simply continue. I was no longer just a keeper of the weather. I was a keeper of a covenant, a fragile piece at the top of the world. The weight of it was immense, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of purpose. One winter, my shortwave radio, my only lifeline to the world of human voices, finally gave up the ghost, a blizzard of static, then nothing. A week later, a real blizzard descended, a whiteout so complete I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I was out checking a line that tethered the station's roof and became disoriented in the swirling chaos. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. I was blind, and then I heard it. A low, resonating call, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones more than in my ears. It wasn't a roar or a cry, but a deep, steady hum. It came from the direction of the station. I stumbled towards it. It called again, a beacon in the screaming wind. It guided me, sound by sound, step by step, back to the safety of my door. He had broken his own rule of silence to save me. He wasn't just my charge. I was his. The bond between us was now one of mutual guardianship, a truth that left me humbled and awestruck in the roaring dark. The following season, his gifts took on a new, more urgent tone. They became warnings about the other inhabitants of our shared territory. One morning, on the offering rock, I found a single, terrifying object, the curved, bone-white claw of a snow leopard, laid carefully beside the indentation where my food had been. It was sharp, pristine, and it was a clear message. I spent the day scanning the ridges with my binoculars, my stomach in knots. 2 days later, I found them, fresh tracks, the distinct pug marks of a large cat, circling the area less than half a kilometer from the station. The animal was hunting here, drawn by the same sparse wildlife I sometimes relied on. The old man hadn't just been acknowledging my offering, he had been telling me, "Be careful. You are not the only hunter on this mountain. We are not alone." The claw was not a trophy. It was an intelligence briefing, a stark reminder of the delicate and dangerous balance of life in this place. A balance I now realized he was actively helping me navigate. This fragile piece, this secret world we had built, was shattered not by a leopard, but by the ugly sound of the modern world. It arrived in late spring, a violent, mechanical snarl that ripped through the sacred silence of the valley. Snowmobiles. Their sound was a sacrilege, a whining, aggressive roar that echoed off the ice walls and made my teeth ache. I watched from the station window as 2 men in brightly colored gear zoomed across the glacier, scarring the pristine snow with their tracks. They were loud, arrogant, and careless, their laughter carrying on the thin air like a disease. They weren't mountaineers. They lacked the respect. They weren't scientists. They lacked the patience. I saw the empty fuel canisters they left behind, the discarded food wrappers. They were trophy hunters, I realized with a cold dread. They were here to conquer something, to take something, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, what prize they were looking for. They set up a base camp a few kilometers down the valley, but their presence was a constant violation. They treated the mountain like their personal playground. Their shouts and the roar of their engines a daily desecration. But the real threat came a few days later. I was on one of my ancillary routes, checking a remote meteorological sensor when I found the first one. A small, dark box strapped to a tree, a glass eye staring blankly at the trail. A motion-activated camera. My heart hammered against my ribs. I followed their tracks and found two more. They were mapping the animal trails, hoping for a glimpse of a bear, a leopard, or something bigger. Then came the moment that turned my blood to ice. I was doing a wide sweep of the area near my station, and I found it, tucked behind a rocky outcrop, its lens aimed with cold, electronic precision directly at our offering rock, the sacred heart of our world, now under the unblinking gaze of a machine. The old man knew. The offering ceased to be taken. The profound silence I had once dreaded returned. But this time it was thick with caution and fear. For 3 nights, the food I left on the rock froze solid, a monument to the intrusion. He was still out there, I knew, watching, waiting. But he would not expose himself. Our pact, our 40-year conversation, was being held hostage by a piece of plastic and glass. I was torn. Part of me, the old, cautious part, wanted to wait them out. But every day they stayed, the risk grew. What if they got bored and decided to hike higher? What if they checked the camera's memory card and found not their prize, but me, leaving food on a rock like some mountain eccentric? The questions would lead them closer, their curiosity a far more dangerous weapon than their rifles. I realized that to do nothing was the most dangerous choice of all. I had to intervene. I had become a guardian, and guardians must sometimes become warriors. The choice solidified in my mind. Cold and hard as the ice around me, I couldn't reason with them. I couldn't appeal to them. I had to become a ghost, a hostile force of the mountain itself. I checked my barometers, my wind charts, the satellite data I could still pull. A severe squall was predicted to roll in 2 nights from then. A fast-moving storm with heavy snow and gale-force winds. It was my cover. My crime would be blamed on the mountain's fury. That night, the untouched food on the rock felt like an accusation. I was about to cross a line from which there was no return. I was no longer just protecting a secret. I was committing a crime to do it. Some secrets are heavier than the mountain, and I was about to shoulder the full weight of this one. A weight that felt chillingly like my brother's pack had felt all those years ago. 2 nights later, as the wind began to howl and the first flakes of snow turned into a blinding curtain, I moved. Dressed in white camouflage I had kept for decades, I became part of the storm. The wind masked my sound. The snow covered my tracks. I was an avenging spirit, a phantom of the peak. I found the first camera and, with a heavy, ice-caked rock, I brought it down on the lens. The crack of the glass was sharp, satisfying, and terrifying. I moved to the next, and the next, a silent wraith of destruction. At the one pointed at our rock, I did not just smash it. I wrenched it from its strap, opened the casing, and packed it with wet, heavy snow, freezing its delicate electronics, destroying its memory. It was an act of quiet, desperate violence, a violation committed to prevent a greater one. I was protecting our sanctuary by desecrating it with an act of human rage. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I made it back to the station just as the squall hit its peak, my body numb with cold, my soul buzzing with adrenaline and a new, colder guilt. This wasn't the passive guilt of survival, it was the active guilt of commission. I had destroyed property. I had lied with my actions, creating a false narrative of a destructive storm. I sat in the dark of my station, the wind rattling the timber, and felt a profound shift within me. I was no longer just a witness. I was a participant, an accomplice. I had chosen my side, irrevocably. The secret was no longer just something I kept. It was something I would now kill for, in my own quiet way. My logbook for that night would be a lie, mentioning only the severity of the storm. The real truth was now buried deeper, another layer of weight on my soul, a secret that bound me even tighter to the creature I was protecting. The hunters stayed for 2 more days, their frustration a palpable cloud over the valley. I heard their engines sputtering in the cold as they checked their ruined equipment, their curses swallowed by the wind. They blamed the storm, their own bad luck, the cheapness of their gear. They never suspected a thing. On the third day, they were gone. The silence that returned was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was a silence of relief, of safety, of a world returned to its rightful state. That evening, with a trembling hand, I placed a larger than usual offering on the rock. It felt different now, more sacred. It wasn't just food, it was an apology for the noise, a reaffirmation of our pact, a testament to the lengths I would go to preserve it. I had committed my first crime for him, and in doing so, I had bound myself to his fate in a way that mere friendship never could. The next morning, the rock was clean, and in the center, where the food had been, lay a single, long, coarse white hair, tied carefully in a loop around a small, smooth river stone. It wasn't a warning or a tool. It felt different. It felt like a thank you. It felt like an acknowledgement of the risk I had taken. It was the most intimate gift he had ever left, a piece of himself, a symbol of the trust that now existed between us, a trust that had been forged in shared solitude and now tempered by shared danger. I picked it up, the strand of hair coarse and surprisingly strong between my fingers. I took it inside and placed it in the small wooden box where I kept my most precious things. A photo of my brother, the fossilized ammonite, and now this. A single hair, a testament to a bond that had become unbreakable, a bond I would soon have to defend against a threat far greater than a pair of reckless hunters. The incident with the hunters changed the tenor of my existence on the mountain. The peace I had known was replaced by a low, humming vigilance. The outside world was no longer a distant abstraction. It had a face, a sound, a tangible, grasping greed. I found myself scanning the horizon more often, listening not just for the weather, but for the unnatural sounds of men. The old man seemed to have changed, too. His presence felt closer, more watchful. The rhythmic tapping from the caves, once just a weather precursor, now sometimes happened when the skies were clear, and I began to wonder if it wasn't just about the weather. Was he practicing? Was he communicating with others of his kind? Was he warning them? The mystery of him, which I thought I was beginning to understand, had only deepened. What was he avoiding on that eastern ridge? What history was he guarding? I had reinforced our sanctuary, but I knew I had only bought us time. The hunters were clumsy, but the world had other tools, smarter tools. I started noticing things I couldn't explain. A faint, high-pitched hum in the air on clear days. A strange, fleeting glint of light from a distant, inaccessible peak. Were these just tricks of the light? Of the thin air? Or was I becoming paranoid? My role had shifted from caretaker to sentinel. I was no longer just observing the mountain. I was standing guard upon its walls. The love I felt for this creature, a love born of shared loneliness and mutual protection, was now tinged with a constant, aching fear. The mountain gives, and the mountain takes. I feared the world was coming to take the one thing the mountain had given me back. My quiet life of penance had become a life of conspiracy. The logbooks were my official lie, a record of wind and snow. My private journal was the truth, a frantic testament to our secret life. The brass fitting I'd hidden years ago felt heavier in its locker, no longer just a curiosity but a harbinger. It was a piece of a story that had happened before, and I felt a growing certainty that it was doomed to happen again. The hunters were just a clumsy prologue. I had proven I would break my own moral code to protect him. I had lied, and I had destroyed. But I had a terrible feeling that the sacrifices required of me were only just beginning. The intimacy of our bond was absolute, but the shadow of the outside world was lengthening, and I knew, deep in my gut, that a far colder, more intelligent storm was gathering on the horizon. The turn came on the 40th anniversary of the avalanche. 40 years, a lifetime. The grief was no longer a storm, but a landscape I had learned to inhabit. It was a quiet, familiar ache, a permanent chill in my bones. Every year on that date, I performed the same ritual. I hiked to the small stone chorten, a memorial cairn, that I built for my brother on the ridge overlooking the Kangchenjunga Glacier. It's a simple pile of stones, but it's the most sacred place in my world. I light a stick of juniper incense, the smoke a thin, fragrant line against the impossible blue of the sky, and I speak his name into the wind. I tell him the barometric pressure. I tell him about the snowpack. I tell him I'm sorry. It's a pointless, private liturgy, a confession to a ghost. But that year, for the first time in 4 decades of lonely remembrance, I was not alone. It was the moment our pact of convenience and survival transformed into something far deeper, something that would set the stage for the terrifying end. I was at the Chorton, the incense smoke stinging my eyes, the cold seeping through the knees of my trousers. I had just spoken my brother's name, the sound swallowed instantly by the immense silence of the peaks. And in that silence, I felt it, a change in the pressure of the air, the feeling of being watched, but not by something predatory. It was a feeling of immense, ancient stillness, a presence that made the hairs on my neck stand on end, not with fear, but with a profound and unnerving awe. I thought at first it was just my grief playing tricks on me, my mind projecting its own weight onto the landscape. But the feeling grew, a static charge in the air, a sense of gravity shifting. I slowly, hesitantly, lifted my head and looked towards the high snowfield that sloped away from the ridge. And my breath caught in my throat, a knot of ice and disbelief. My 40-year vigil was about to have a witness, and my world was about to break wide open. There, partially obscured by a massive snowdrift perhaps 100 yards away, was a figure. It was sitting on its haunches, perfectly still, like a statue carved from the mountain itself. It was huge, broader than any bear, its form immense even at that distance. Its fur was the color of old snow in shadow, a deep, creamy white that blended almost perfectly